all you really need to do is flip this boolean true or false based on what roles the user has, and that's basically the fundamentals of RBAC in NestJS. Hey, how's it going? Welcome back to the channel. In this video, we're going to talk about authorization. In a previous video, I've made one on authentication with NestJS. A lot of people have been asking in the comments to cover authorization, so I thought, here we go, we're gonna do that video exactly. I do pay attention to the comments, so make sure if you have any feedback, you got any requests, make sure to put that in there. As always, if you can provide an early thumbs up to this video, I'd highly appreciate that. With that said, let's get started. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to create a new application from scratch. That's what I always do in a lot of these videos so that you guys can kind of follow along. In my desktop, I'm just going to create a new NestJS application. So I'm just going to call that Nest Authorization, hit enter, and I'm going to use npm here. All right, next I'm going to open this in VS Code. All right, with that new Nest application open in VS Code, first thing we're going to do is create some initial boilerplate for us. So first of all, to do authorization, we need to know who the user is and what roles do they have. Second, to do this tutorial, we want to be able to represent some kind of example API where we can protect some things and allow other things to be completely open depending on what roles the user has. So I was thinking we're going to create a new resource users, and we'll select REST API here, and we will generate CRUD endpoints because within those CRUD endpoints, we're going to select which ones are allowed as an admin, which one is allowed as a generic user, etc. All right, so with that in place, once we have that generated, you'll notice that we have this new users folder, and there's going to be a bunch of initial stuff in here. We're going to have a users controller that has your typical CRUD. You got your create, read, update, delete. Moving forward, so we got a users entity in here, which represents what our users look like. So to kind of get started, our user needs to have roles of some sort, right? So for us to be able to do role-based authorization, for example, we need to be able to tell, is a user an admin? Is it a generic user, or maybe however many roles that you have? All right, so to get started, let's add a roles property in here, and let's just start with having that as a string array, right? Basically, we're saying that a user can have one to many roles. If this were a database entity, this could also be potentially a relation to another database table. So for example, you could have a user table and a roles table. So a user can have one to many roles. How you actually implement it in your own application, will differ depending on your use case. Here, we're just going to keep it simple. We've got a user entity that has a list of roles as a string array. And just to add something else in here, we'll do name string. All right, so that's the first thing we need. The second thing we need is for us to be able to tell, which endpoints are allowed for admins versus generic users. We first need to be able to have a representation of those different roles, right? So just to keep things simple, we can start with potentially a simple enum file. Let's do a role.enum.ts, and we're just going to create a simple enum here of role, and let's do user equals user and admin equals admin, right? So we just have basically a list of potential roles. In this case, we just have user and admin. You absolutely can create, more for your use case. All right, so with those two things in place, let's first run our application and see, how does it behave originally. We're gonna run our application using npm run start dev. And then once our application is running, I'm gonna use Thunder Client to make a request to HTTP localhost 3000, which is the default port for local development with NestJS. If I hit send here, I'm going to get a hello world message. And then remember, we created a set of endpoints for users earlier. So we should be able to do something like get/users. And we're going to get, right now it just returns strings. It's not actually implemented in any way. But you can also see that I can do a post/users, which says this action adds a new user. We can do a patch, I believe, patch/users/ some kind of ID. Let's say user/1, and it'll say this action updates a user. And then we can also do delete on that /ID path, and it will say this action removes a user. So we have sort of a mock API of sorts here. we don't really need to implement the actual thing that happens when you make these requests. All we need to do RBAC is say that we need to figure out what role does the user have and are they allowed to access these requests. All right, so where do we go from here? We know that we have an endpoint and it's completely open to everyone right now, right? We're able to make each one of those CRUD requests, create, read, update, delete. Let's talk about what our requirements would look like if we were to actually add RBAC authorization. So let's say that we talked about having effectively two types of users. We have admin and just a generic user. So what kind of actions do these guys have? Let's say that an admin can basically do everything, right? So they can get users, they can edit users, which really in the HTTP, that's the patch. They can also delete users. And this, of course, also includes get by ID. Now, what if you were a non-admin generic user? What can you do? Let's just say that the best they can do is read, right? They can get users or get by ID, right? And they can't update users and they can't delete users. All they can do is read the data, right? So that's kind of the distinction between admin and user in our tutorial here, is that an admin has management capabilities and a user simply can read. Now, obviously, in a typical application, there's a little bit more complexity here where perhaps a specific user can also patch themselves, like they can edit their own data, right? Like something like patch users/ID, assuming where ID is their own ID. We might cover that here, but for now, we'll stick with the simple, we want to be able to tell, do you have access to do some things and do you not have access to do some things, right? So we're going to start with that. So our next steps is within the user's controller, we need to be able to say that everything here except for the get is an admin only privilege, right? So we need to be able to somehow decorate this method. Any of the non-get methods, they need to be somehow decorated with this is only for an admin. Now, how do we do that? To some degree, you already know that in NestJS, there's a way to add sort of metadata or descriptions to a method via decorators, right? So for example, the way we're able to tell Nest that, hey, this class method is a post, an HTTP post. We're using the post decorator here, and same thing for, patch and delete. So ideally, we're able to add maybe a custom decorator here that allows us to tell NestJS that, hey, this is only for admins. And how do you do that? So one way to do that is using the SetMetadata decorator, and this takes in a key. So what is it that you're trying to provide metadata for? In our case, it's roles. And then we need to provide, okay, what roles are allowed in this method, which said that this is only allowed for admin. So we're going to do role.admin, right? So this is effectively saying I am providing metadata to this method that this is only allowed for roles admin. All right, so pretty simple, right? So you absolutely can, just provide set metadata basically everywhere you want. Everywhere you want to say that, oh, this is only for an admin, you provide set metadata. Now, one thing that's not super great about that approach is that you're constantly importing set metadata and constantly providing this roles key. There is a way for us to provide a custom decorator that effectively represents the same thing that this thing can do. So within our users directory, let's just create a new roles decorator. And within this file, I'm going to import that set metadata. And then we're going to export a simple roles method, which takes in a string array of roles and sets the metadata to that, right? So this is basically equivalent to what we've been setting on our methods earlier, like this, right? So it's a simple wrapper that allows us to completely replace this with roles. And then we can just provide our role.admin here, and we can remove the set metadata. And that's basically the same exact thing. So it's a little bit cleaner and it will reduce a lot of boilerplate for you. So I highly recommend doing this. All right, so with that in place, what we've basically done here is we've created a small utility for us to allow to add metadata to any class method, to any controller method, that allows us to say what role is required to run this, to make this request. Now that doesn't actually protect the method yet, we're just providing metadata. So there is still a missing piece here for us to kind of actually protect this. Now, one quick note, if you did want to improve the type checking a little bit, is you can replace this string with specifically the enum that we have. So this could be a role enum. Instead of it just being any string, you can say that this is specifically a role, right? So this is going to prevent you from passing in, something that doesn't exist as a role. So it adds a little bit of touch checking for you, right? So let's bring that back to role.admin. All right, so let's go ahead and actually start implementing the piece that adds the actual security in here, right? So if you watched my previous video on NestJS authentication, I talk about guards in that video, and guards are basically just like what they sound like. They're guards to a request. They're kind of a middleware that says, do I allow this person to move forward or not? So we're going to create a guard that says, I want to figure out what roles does this request require, and does the current user making this request have this role, and then am I going to let this person pass or not, right? So they're a guard. So within the users folder, again, we're going to create a new roles guard. Now I'm going to paste some code in here and I'm going to talk about it. So a roles guard really has a structure like it's a class, it's an injectable class that implements can activate, and it has to have this can activate method, and it's going to able to take in the specific execution context, and then within that you need to add some logic of blah blah blah, does this person have access, and then based on that logic you need to return true or false. So basically say, if you have access, return true so that the person can move forward, otherwise return false, and then it's automatically gonna return a 403 HTTP response, right? So let's first kind of test this in action to make sure you understand what's going on, right? So if we simply return false here, then it's probably gonna block access to everything, right? So we just want to make sure that it actually works. The underlying logic here of how to flip this true or false boolean is what we're going to do next, but let's just make sure that this guard is doing what it's supposed to be doing. Before we can do that, we need to actually register this guard in our module. So within the app module, the root app module, I'm actually just going to add it as a provider. And all this does is it says that basically I'm saying that register this roles guard globally across my entire application. And once you register it globally like this, it's now going to run on every single controller and method that we have. So if we go back to our Thunder client request here, if we did a get of /users, we're now getting a 403 forbidden, because now the guard, you can think of the guard as if they're standing in front of every single HTTP request that comes into our application, and it's gonna say, it's gonna go into this guard and it's gonna return false. So when it returns false, you're gonna get back a 403 forbidden. And if this was returning true, it's basically saying, yes, you have access. If we hit send here again in our Thunder client, is going to get back our 200 again, right? So all you really need to do is flip this boolean true or false based on what roles the user has, and that's basically the fundamentals of RBAC in NestJS, right? So let's actually implement this to work. So if we were saying that, again, just to review, we're saying that the create is an admin only operation, right? At least we're starting with that. We're also going to do that for patch and update, patch and delete here in a second, but let's just start with create. We want to say that only admins can create users. All right, so let's go back to our roles guard and implement the actual logic that should be in the middle here. All right, so what do we need to do here? First of all, we need to extract from the execution context what is the required role, right? From, in our case, in an example, right, we're saying that create has a required role of admin. We need to be able to extract that admin role. And then next, we need to check, does the current user making the request have those required roles, right? One-to-many roles. All right, so how do we extract the required roles? Here's what we're gonna do. We're gonna do required roles equals this dot reflector. Notice that we have a reflector class in here that's coming in from the constructor. It's being injected through dependency injection, and you don't have to completely understand what the reflector does, but the gist of it is that it's used to read these kind of things. It sort of allows you to read what's the metadata that we provided, right? That's what a reflector does. And then so in here we're gonna do reflector.getAll and override. And I'm going to talk about later what those other options are, but we're just going to say this has a type of role, which is the enum that we provided. And you have to provide a key in here similar to our set metadata earlier, so we're going to do roles, and then within this array as the second argument, we're going to do context.getHandler and context.getClass. And again, you don't have to completely fully understand what this is doing, but the gist of it is just that it's trying to pull in the metadata for that specific context of, in this case, you can imagine that the context of making a create user request is that it's in this user's controller class and it's in this create method, right? That's what this context stuff is trying to do. It's trying to figure out what, where is this happening. So required roles, if done correctly, is going to have role.admin for a create request. All right, so what do we do next? Now, our next step here is we said that we need to figure out, does the current user making a request have those required roles? Where first of all, you need to get the user in the first place. And the way to do that is by, again, getting the user from the context. Now, this is going to be a little bit confusing because we didn't actually implement authentication in this tutorial application. So we don't actually have this object. We don't know what the user is and who the user is. So that's actually a number one required for you to be able to do RBAC, right? You need to actually be able to log in the user so that you know who the user is. But we didn't do that. I do have a video in my channel covering specifically authentication to figure out how do you log a user in, how do you tell who the user is, and if you're able to do that, this is how you would extract the user. So if you're not sure how to do authentication and allowing the user to be extracted like this, make sure to check out that video. But in our case here, we're going to keep it really simple because we don't have authentication in place here, which you should in a real application. We're actually just going to comment this out and we're going to mock the user as if we did that, right? So let's imagine that the user has my name and we're going to say that I have a admin role, right? We're going to give this a type of the user entity. All right, so now that we know who the user is, we're going to say, does this current user have the required roles? So that's pretty simple, right? We just do a little bit of, basic logic. So we're going to say required roles dot sum. If you're not familiar with sum, it's basically like saying is at least one of the items in this array returning true for a callback that we provide. So what's our callback? We're going to say that for each role, does the user's roles include that role, right? So for example, if I have a role admin, then I should be able to do this create request, right? Let's start with having this maybe as just a generic user, so we can prove that it's protected, and when we switch it later, we should be able to prove that as an admin I now have access. All right, so that's our basic guard logic. Now there's one missing piece in here that we need to make sure we add so that it doesn't break the application. We need to specify that if there is no required role, right? If this returns empty, there's no roles required for a method, then we just let it pass. So we're going to turn true. So for example, in our user's controller, we have other methods in here that does not yet have a roles decorator like this. So there's no metadata on what roles are required. We're just going to assume that those are all accessible to anybody, right? So that's what this is going to do, is if there's no required roles, it's just going to return true for each one of these. And to kind of show that in action, you'll notice that if I hit a get request, I'm going to get a 200 OK on the /users. If I were to remove that, it's going to break. So I'm going to do another get request on /users. I'm going to get a 500 internal server error. And if we look at the logs, it's going to say, it can't figure out what the sum of something is because it's undefined. And where is that coming from? That's coming from here. It's saying it can't do sum on required roles is undefined because there's no required roles, right? So you need to make sure to add that in. All right, so with all of those pieces in place, I believe we now should have a completely working roles guard, right? So again, remember right now we're simulating that I am just a generic user, a non-admin user, which means that I should not be able to do a create user, right? So if I go back to my Thunder client and I do a post, HTTP post on /user, and I hit a send, obviously in a typical request, you would have a request body here, but we're keeping it simple. We're just keeping it empty. So when I hit send here, it's going to tell me 403 forbidden, because I'm not an admin. If I go back to my roles guard here and change my mock here to say that I am now an admin, and then back again in our post/users, I'm going to hit send, and it's going to say to uncreated. It means that it allowed me to move forward because it sees that this request requires an admin, and the guard notices that this user has that role. Then this returns true, and when it returns true, it allows us to move forward, right? So that's basically it. If we were to do the rest of this logic of, oh, only an admin can do editing users and deleting users, how do you do that? Well, that just means we need to copy this roles admin to our patch here, as well as our delete, and that will protect it to make sure that only admins can do that operation. And that's it, guys. That's honestly the RBAC 101 authorization for NestJS. That's the gist of what you need to know and understand, is that you need to be able to add metadata to your methods, and then you need to be able to create a guard to read that metadata and read the user's roles, and you put all those three things together and you got yourself an RBAC implementation. Now, obviously, again, we're doing simple RBAC here, right? We're only doing basic roles. There's other situations where you might want to have some kind of access control list, or perhaps maybe you're doing some kind of claims-based authorization, maybe with scopes in, OAuth or something like that. So for example, instead of it just being simple, an admin has this access or not, it might change it to something like a set of actions that a role can do. So for example, maybe this would change to an admin has access to do these actions of create user, update user, delete user, and a generic user would just have, read, right? And how is that different? Well, you may or may not actually still have a representation of roles. Maybe you just have a representation of permissions, right? Maybe a user has a list of permissions. So how that might look is you might create, same steps that we did before, but you'd probably create something like a custom decorator that looks like this, maybe a required permissions, and then some kind of enum for those different types of permissions. So you might have like permission that create user, right? So it's not specifically tied to a role anymore. Perhaps it's tied to a set of actions, right? So if you were to do something like that, obviously it changes a little bit what the logic is for your guard. Instead of you extracting required roles, you would be extracting what are the required permissions that this method requires. And then on top of that, you need to figure out what permissions does my user have, and you need to be able to do something similar to to this. So it's gonna be a little bit more involved if you're to do all of that from scratch. Now, what I do recommend is you look into specific libraries that are designed to handle this type of logic. So the two examples that I would recommend, one is CASL. You can see that so you'll notice in their example here, they're able to define abilities. So for example, they have can read posts and comments, can manage posts if they're the author, and they can also create comments. And they can take those set of abilities and effectively turn that into a set of rules, right? So in their example here, they have ability can read a post, which would return true because that's one of the abilities that they've defined here, right? They can read posts. So this is one example of a way. So in our code earlier, right, we have a description here of an admin, or user X can do these things. That's kind of the same idea as what we have here, is that we need something that can define abilities, right? On the right here, we can define a set of abilities, kind of like what we have in the left here for a specific type of user. And then we need something that is able to, in the future, figure out whether or not a user has those rules or abilities in place, right? Another good example of a solution for this is the access control library, which is also pretty popular in the Node ecosystem. They have something similar here where you can, another example, right? Slightly different syntax, where they're able to create some kind of role user that has access to do these actions. They can create their own videos, they can delete their own videos, they can read. An admin is able to update anything and delete anything, right? So you need a different solution to do a more complex version of claims-based or permission-based authorization. So that's what I would recommend if you have very complex authorization requirements that's around, claims-based authorization or permission-based authorization. It's not just simple roles like we did in this tutorial. Look into these solutions, and these solutions should be able to work with NestJS as well. It'll just take a little bit more setup. So I would consider that sort of the advanced authorization for NestJS. If that's something you want to see in this channel, let me know in the comments. It's definitely, I didn't want to cover it in this video because it'd probably take another 2 hours just to cover that because it's quite complex. But just so you know, it is covered in the NestJS authorization docs. They have examples in here of specifically integrating with CASL, right? One of the libraries that I just suggested. So there are some docs in here on how to do exactly that. It's definitely much more involved. Anyways, guys, I think that about wraps up the video for today. If you have any feedback from me, let me know in the comments. And again, I would appreciate a subscribe. There's a lot of you that view my videos that are not subscribed. Something like 80% of people watching my content is not subscribed. Please consider subscribing if you're finding value in the content that I make. It lets me know that, hey, people are watching, I should make more. And also make sure to hit that like button to let the algorithm know, hey, this is a good video that I found meaningful. If not, let me know in the comments, what did you not like about the video. Anyways, that's it for me today. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you on the next one. Thanks.